here while you guys are meeting or no?
Sure. Yeah. Okay.
Also, I want to max out my IRA right now. I have $5,000 in cash, so can you help me with that later?
Okay. Just
Like, what should I buy?
ATI or SPY or something. I don't know.
Hey Rick, how's it going?
Hey, it's going well. How are you?
Good.
Glad to hear. I saw an interesting thread in Rails. There's like an instrumentation working group. Have you guys seen this?
No, I'm not aware of it.
Yeah, no, I haven't seen that.
I think someone from Skylight or one of the folks started. Let me try to find it. I recognized, I think Michael was on it from New Relic as well. It's a bit old though, so it's unclear whatever happened here, but it looked interesting. Yes. Oh, I also read a good blog from one of your colleagues, Francis and Robert, about Raptors.
Is that from Kier?
Smart,
Chatra?
a smart person. Yeah, Kira, or I'm blanking.
Kier.
Yeah, yeah. Thought it was above my head, but really thoughtful.
Yeah, he seems really sharp. I've interacted with him a few times. He does a lot of good work in the company from what I've seen.
All right. Yeah, I guess you guys are. It's where like Datadog Ruby is like 3 people in a corner, and
Yeah.
like, if I forget the Shopify, it's just like, well, yeah, of course, everyone is. It's like 7 people. I don't know.
Would you say like what is the bulk of people, or is it a lot of like smaller groups?
Go and Python is the vast majority of things. The agent, which is sort of like the core thing, is mostly written in Go, with some of the integrations being Python. And then the back end is a little bit of a Frankenstein because of acquisitions. but a lot of Go in the back end with, I think some of the web back end is Python, and then the logs company that is now part of Datadog is Java. So it sort of ends up being a little Frankenstein-y.
Yeah.
I guess I don't know. I guess that's normal for merger. Is it all, do you guys do a lot outside of Ruby?
I'd say the two, or I guess there's the three main languages you'll see is Ruby, Go, and then JavaScript, TypeScript, whatever you want to call it for front end stuff.
Yeah,
So.
makes sense.
Looks like we have pretty much the usual crew at about the usual time. So maybe jump into the spec PR or spec sig, and then come back to our repo unless folks have other ideas. Screen share. All right, so kind of first issue we started talking about was how to get a default value for service name. We talked about this, I think, during the last SIG meeting. We spent a long time talking about this, and at some point I started recommending, why don't we just have a default resource that you just, that has default values, and then if you don't like those, you can supply some other ones somewhere along like in the merging process of the resource. And it became slightly clear that there was some weirdness with resource merge actually that made that not a great idea, but I think people, apparently like the first value wins in resource merging. And I'm not sure if that's how our implementation works or not. But that makes that situation difficult unless the default resource ends up being the last resource that you merge. But I think the discussion moved to like, well, why does merge work that way? Like no other merges preserve the initial value. So I think the consensus was we should be able to change that to make more sense.
Yeah,
So,
that's always been a weirdness in the resource merge. I honestly don't remember why it was built that way or designed that way. But yeah, it's the opposite of every other merge.
yeah,
I think for the help,
oh, go ahead.
I think for the helper we exposed in the configuration, we set it up so the last in wins. So like it goes against like the actual merge, just like flops them. So it like makes it work. But yeah, sorry.
Got it. So you kind of start with an empty resource, merge all the user things, and then merge the default one last. But yeah, at any rate, it seemed like it was a useful discussion and that we will fix this. I was already under the assumption that it works this way. So hopefully I won't have to change my mental model. This led slightly into a discussion of like, is anybody concerned that tracing is supposed to be stable, but there isn't a Jaeger spec? And then people said yes. And then they were asking for a champion, and I spoke up saying that I was an anti-champion, but like that there are a bajillion different export formats from Jaeger as far as I could tell. So like that should be taken into account when the spec is written, and that if it's just written for one format, it's not going to work for everyone. And then people were saying that, well, we should just pick a format. And then I kind of just mentioned that if you do that, there's a good chance SIGs will have to rewrite their Jaeger exporter from the ground up because they implemented a different format. So I think that's where that landed anyways. There will probably be some spec that comes along. Hopefully it will be inclusive of many formats. Like as long as you can get your spans into Jaeger, I feel like you have completed that task some way. And then there was this question about the name, service name versus possibly app name, and this person's perspective was that the thing that's reporting might not be a service. It might be like a desktop application, for example. And I think kind of the consensus was it was a bike shed in the beginning, and this is the one that won, and probably not worth bike shedding again. And then kind of the last thing is that there is supposed to be an all-day workshop for metrics on Friday. So if you're interested, yeah, if you are interested,
Right.
show up. There is an agenda.
And just at a high level, is the point of the workshop to sort of hammer out some details that allow metrics to get to GA, beta? I don't know.
I think to some degree, yes. I think maybe the other point, and I'm hoping the other point, I'm very much considering coming to this if I can find time in my schedule, but I think people have been like really tracing focused, at least out of the gate for OpenTelemetry, and there's been like a subset of those people, or maybe even a disjoint set of people that have been a little bit more interested in metrics, but it seems like it's been a smaller group. So I believe some of the desire is to like bring everybody from the OTel community into the metrics discussion and just kind of get more interest there. And I think the hope is that that will help kind of hammer out the details and just get more participation. Because I think that's one of the problems is, and I think we even see this in tracing where like you have people floating ideas and really soliciting feedback, and just, you know, the feedback will help drive the final decision. It's not like they're idealists. They're like, hey, we could go down path A or B. Let's talk about this. And then it's just kind of silence and people don't know what to do.
Right.
So I think just trying to get more people to have opinions in some of these areas, like drive stuff.
Okay. Yeah, I know there's some folks from my end who are more involved in metrics than me, and there is a big push on DD Sketch as an aggregation algorithm. They really want that. And I know there was some contention there, so I will maybe have one of them attend, or I will attend and just sit quietly and not know what I'm doing. But that's good I'll share this. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think histogram support right here is on the list.
Yeah, there's some weird political thing around DD Sketch versus some, I don't know, math is complicated. I don't know. So
yeah, I think math is complicated. I think there are several sketches that are well regarded. I know DD Sketch is one of them. I think like, yeah, I think at one point the question was like, would OTel have permission to use DD Sketch? So I think
yeah,
useful to know.
Yeah, for sure. They want it in there. It's more, there was some other vendor who's like, we want to do our thing and then whatever. Anyway, I'm getting off topic, but thank you. I'll share this and try to have someone to talk from Datadog.
Cool. Awesome. So that's it for the spec sig. Any questions or comments, things I didn't cover? I guess maybe I'll speak up. There's one thing I didn't cover, which wasn't from the spec sig. It was from the maintainers meeting. And it was really the question I asked internally last week. And that was like, what are we even calling these things now? Because we had this versioning, the versioning and compatibility OTEP. Actually, there's two things. There's one more thing I'll mention after this, but we've had that OTEP, and I think we were calling all this work that we were doing GA, and the way kind of like the versioning scheme came out, I was just like wondering, like, what is the thing that we're working on right now? And is like, when tracing is 1.0, do we call this GA? And I think that is not the case. I think we'll just call it tracing 1.0. GA is more nebulously going to be announced when tracing and metrics are 1.0 for languages, and I guess once like 4 core languages or something reach that point, they will make some buzz about OpenTelemetry being GA. So I don't know if that distinction is important to anybody, but
I mean, it's useful to know in terms of the milestones that we're working towards. I deleted or closed our existing 0 point whatever milestones because they're all out of date. So right now we have an RC, and I can't remember if it's a 1.0 or a GA milestone. The latter isn't really relevant. The RC seems to be the relevant one, and I think that's the one that we want to be working towards, although maybe we need to clarify that that's RC for tracing.
yeah, I think at some point we should probably use the same terminology, just so that we so there isn't any confusion. I think yeah, I think some of the confusion is like people, or if and when people are asking when SIGs expect to GA, like I think it matters a lot if that means tracing is 1.0 or tracing and metrics is 1.0. And then, yeah, there was actually one other thing that I forgot because it wasn't its own bullet point. I think we talked about this last time, and this is generally around, I think they kind of took instrumentation off of the versioning and stability, or didn't really take it off the versioning and stability thing. I think they've kind of said that it is not expected to be stable yet because we need to figure out what it means for a change to occur in your telemetry. So, so Tigran is floating this idea of a telemetry schema. I think we talked about this a little bit last week as being one of the potential ways forward to solve this. But basically the idea is like, what if a semantic convention changes format? What if we add one? What if we remove one? What does this mean for the back end? What does this mean for us and like a version number that we assign to subsequent releases? So I have not read through this, but I know when we talked about this last time, we were a little bit concerned about how restrictive something like this will be, and just how it will interact with trying to version different packages. But whatever the case, this is the beginning of that discussion. So I think anybody who is interested in this should kind of pay attention and participate. And if this is a good idea, we should pursue it. If it looks like it's heading down a path that might be problematic, we should speak up before it gets too far out of hand. But yeah, I need to give this a read through and think about it a little bit before I have any critiques or much to say about it. Any thoughts out of the gate here?
The other thing for spans is links and parenting information. This is particularly weird for Kafka in the spec. There's a bunch of examples in the semantic conventions for messaging around Kafka, and it's difficult to implement some of those things in Ruby Kafka as spec, but Robert and I have been over this many times, and it looks like linking is more important than parent information in the Kafka processing spans. But like, it's a breaking change if you switch a link to be a parent, for example, or vice versa.
Yeah, I think that's true. I guess just thinking this through, like one potential thing that I could see like being a hidden problem, like for something like Ruby, is that like the data type or even just kind of like the format of a value could change with like, you know, a release of Rails, for example. We're just kind of pulling an attribute off and adding it under a certain label. And I know I've seen it in the past where things change or things change names. Sometimes you just lose the attribute altogether because it wasn't where you were pulling it from any longer, or there was a refactor in Rails that changed something to some degree. So I feel like there can be some unknown changes, I guess, that have nothing to do with your instrumentation and kind of everything to do with the thing that's being instrumented. And these are probably more likely to occur in something like Ruby, where typing is a little more amorphous. But
Not with Ruby 3. We'll just all upgrade.
this is true.
Problem solved. Yeah, I think it's a good idea. I don't know about addition of a span attribute constituting a breaking change. I don't understand why that's breaking, but you know, I think this is important to have. I think vendors will need it, because if you dashboard around it and you do alerting around it, something like a span name, if it changes it, it really shoots people in the foot. So I think it's good. I'll try to comment. Probably won't.
Yeah, I think those are exactly the things that this is being proposed to solve. So. Cool. All right, so for real, I think the spec sig and other extra sig portion is over for now. So moving on to Hotel Ruby, what should we start with here? Issues, PRs, something else?
I have a light one that we could maybe talk over quickly. John, you put up that add minimum gem version for Ruby Kafka. I'd like to comment just to see if kind of makes sense, the idea there. So basically he used a version that wasn't covered by an appraisal. It broke. I gave him a sad face. But I was wondering for like the install flow, if we should start setting a minimum version check that is at parity with the lowest appraisal we've set, because like it's not stopping anyone from using anything outside of what like we've defined in the appraisal. So there's no guarantee that it'll work, and you'll have like the unforeseen circumstances of it breaking. But then like to kind of counter argue the idea of adding that minimum check, like if it works with a version that we don't necessarily want to officially support, should we prevent people from using it with like a hard check like that? I don't really know what the right thing is there, but I think it's worth some discussion.
Yeah, so I don't know. I believe there is this compatible check in the instrumentation base class. And if that is there, I added that with this as like a, that was one of the things that I thought would probably happen there, is you would do a version comparison. I think the, at least, yeah, that was for like at least the instrumentation descriptor file, because I believe we try not to depend on the underlying library. That was kind of the other thing. So you wouldn't use the gem spec necessarily. Yeah, so I think there's actually one more, I think there's one more hook called compatible, if I'm not mistaken. It's been a while since I looked at this code. So it's in the docs. Yeah, so it kind of mentions this in the comment even. So there's definitely there's definitely a mechanism to make this check, and this is one thing that I thought we'd probably do. I think it makes sense to have a minimum version to prevent people from figuring out stuff the hard way. And in the event that somebody figures out that it's a little bit too restrictive and would like to loosen that, the restriction, I think they can do the due diligence to make sure that it works and open a PR suggesting to make the change. I don't know, does that sound like a reasonable approach?
I think so. Like, I think people are, for me, it's just like, put out this gem and someone loads it up and it breaks, and that's a pretty lousy experience. I think they're aware that this is all under construction and new, but still, it's not great. So yeah, I think I was a little concerned that it'd be a little too restrictive, but if we err to that side and are just really open to taking PRs to loosen if it's needed, then I think that kind of is it's just a reasonable solution.
I think it is, and I think when people start wanting to use OpenTelemetry, having these published somewhere will be helpful. I don't know, I think I'm not sure if you have this at Datadog, if you have like a table that kind of like lays out minimum versions of things supported. I know a lot of vendors often do, and these end up being questions that customers have, and it's usually like a conscious effort to remove older versions.
Yeah, we do. It's in our docs. Let me share it. I think the difference is it sucks maintaining old stuff. And so if you can avoid it, you're kind of, the problem is all it takes is like one sort of enterprisey person to sneak in with a super old version or something, and you're sort of like peer pressured into maintaining it forever, at least at the vendor side, which will, whatever, this is an open source project, but it'll end up like trickling down into peer pressure on this project. So like the sooner you can nudge people away from that, the better. Otherwise you're stuck maintaining node 6, for example. But yeah, I do think having like a compatibility thing like this is probably helpful. Oh, that's the wrong. Sorry, it's been a minute. You'd think I know my docs better. It's here somewhere. Well, I'll share it. But okay, I'll stop talking now.
Cool.
We should, yeah, keep the min version. Is what I'm saying.
Yeah, so I think min version is fine. I think my comment on this PR is we should use the compatible check for the version.
Yeah, I honestly, I wasn't aware of the compatible check. That makes a lot of sense. And I think there's at least one or two other places where we're not using it and we could be. So I think that's something that I can follow up with and correct.
Cool. This is the correct link. So yeah, at some point we should have one of these as well. One of these and possibly some kind of a, so we don't end up getting strong armed into maintaining something incredibly old for eternity. Some kind of policy around what we expect to maintain.
So our policy so far has generally been if it's not supported by the upstream project, then we don't support it. So we've used that to kind of age out versions of Ruby that we support. I can't remember if that's true for Rails as well, but certainly for Ruby, we've been aging out the version based on when like Ruby core stops supporting a version of Ruby, we stop supporting it as well.
Yeah, I personally like that policy. I feel like as we get more and more users, and if God forbid an enterprise user, like these things could become a little more contentious, but I think starting out this way is the right way to do it. If we need to talk to expand those things a little bit, like I think that's fine. I know when we had these original discussions, like I proposed ideas of like, what if you had like Ruby EOL date plus a year or something for, to allow some stragglers to straggle a little bit, but I think something where the goalposts are pretty close together and not super far apart. So starting strict and maybe being able to relax that stuff a little bit if we have to is the right idea. Don't start relaxed because people will want to relax that even more and it will get out of hand pretty quickly. Anything else to talk about on this?
I had saw over while I was off, there was some issues with Ruby 3 and some of the Kafka tests. I'll just mention that I'm gonna look at that this week and see if I can get that sorted out, because it's kind of blocking for that PR just even adding additional appraisals. So I'll be looking to that this week, but that's all I got for repo stuff.
I had a few things. One is I had a PR up to release 0.12.1. I just realized that wasn't approved and was not merged. I just just merged a new PR. I'm thinking I'll close this release, start a new release, and it'd be cool if I could get reasonably quick turnaround on approving that release.
Yeah, I saw this. I was unsure if it was for real or not. So yeah, I'll make sure if I see these two.
Yeah, this one was for real. This was a couple of the small changes that I think Johnny Shields had asked for. Yeah, there were a bunch of small things in here.
All right, yeah. I'll keep an eye out for the next one. Sorry for not eagerly approving this one.
Yeah, no worries. Normally I would lean on Robert to eagerly approve it, but for some reason he was on vacation or something. I don't know.
Acceptable.
Yeah, I'll talk to his manager. Oh wait. So I'll pick the easy one first. Sidekick semantic conventions. There's a PR up to fix this. Blake is one of the guys on our team as well, Shopify. This is the interesting bit of this, is that the semantic conventions for messaging state that the message queue should be part of the span name. So you get like the queue name space send for enqueuing things, and the queue name space process for actually processing things. For like in our experience at Shopify, generally the queue name is not that interesting. What tends to be interesting is the job class name. I've proposed just adding the job class name as another attribute, so that we stick with the semantic conventions, but we also have the job class name in case people want to add a processor to rename this, to basically use the class name, because that's what they care about for their analysis. So yeah, you probably want to look at the comment in the main part of the issue.
Yeah, I agree that the job is probably the more and most useful thing, I think, for Sidekick and generally these background job processors in Ruby. So yeah.
So yeah, the queue name is already an attribute. The job class name is not part of the semantic conventions. So I propose just using messaging.sidekick.job class, which seems to match how we add kind of queues specific, or whatever, messaging system specific attributes. With those two in place, you can use a processor to just rename the span to whatever you need, or to do all your processing just on attribute names and ignore the span name altogether. So that's one thing. We had a discussion last week about what happens if people don't want to use the OpenTelemetry collector and they're just instrumenting their app and sending directly. So this also kind of plays into that. So the other option is that we provide a configuration flag for the Sidekick instrumentation to use the job class name instead. It's a little more specific, a little less general, but it lets us pump the problem a little bit.
I think that makes sense to me because like just thinking from like someone using it, if I'm just working on a Rails application, I don't necessarily care about the queue. Like I like that the information would be associated with the span, but if like I think that kind of like the really interesting part is like what job is it? Like, I don't want to see all my jobs grouped under a single span name to me because to me they're fundamentally different, right? So like having it be like each unique name or whatever instead of like you know, default process, like it's not very informative. I think like the user experience is kind of poor there. So I think thinking of like our team, like Shopify specific, like we could do the span processor and do the rename, and I think that's something that would make sense for us and just like be beneficial to people who are consuming this data. But for a group, like you said, that doesn't have or all that infrastructure set up, being able to easily set a default, I think is pretty important. I think it's just like a nice kindness. I'd almost like go as far to say like the default should be the job class name, but I know that doesn't adhere to the spec, which is a whole other thing that I don't want to dig into.
Yeah, I tend to feel that we should try to adhere to semantic conventions by default, and if we're going to allow changing that, then provide the configuration options or provide some mechanism with span processor. We had a discussion last week about why that's challenging the way span processes in kind of on the server side, not in the collector, but on the server side are defined. But yeah, I don't think we need to rehash this. I can bring you up to speed if you want, or you can listen to last week's recording. Either way.
I do have maybe a slightly different perspective on this. And my gut feeling is that a background job processor is not a messaging system. It uses a messaging system. And like if in the case of Sidekick, the messaging system to me is Redis. And it's the enqueuing and dequeuing of a message on Redis that again, it is a thing that falls into this gray area of, is it a data store? Is it a queue? But that the background job processor is something that's built on top of this. And I think I can't imagine any user wanting the name of your Redis queue over the name of your background job for something like this. So I don't know that the semantic conventions or the specification is aware of this kind of ecosystem and has really kind of considered it in the way that maybe it should be.
Yeah, I mean, we had some discussion along those lines early on and concluded that messaging system or messaging semantic conventions were the closest to job processing, and so we would overlay it in that way. But I agree that like realistically it would be better to have a job processing semantic conventions or a background job mechanism, maybe batch job. I don't know what the terminology would be for that, but something that is a little bit closer to that. I don't know if that's applicable to other languages.
Yeah, I do feel like it is definitely something that is in the Ruby world, but probably not like in the Go world, for example. But I think um, what little I know about Python, I know that there are some similar frameworks there, like Celery, I think is one that I can at least name. So I'm not sure what the Python folks have done here, but it might be worth looking into or just asking the question. Um, yeah,
Yeah, I mean, the short form of this is that the span names as defined by the messaging semantic conventions aren't particularly relevant here. It's other than the way you view the trace. So if you look at a trace waterfall, then sure, maybe it's interesting, but the availability of both the queue name and the background job class name, I think is important so that people can do analysis on either one of those. I've had some debates internally about this, and basically sometimes you want, depending on what your role is, you may want SLIs defined in terms of the job queue, and in other cases, you may want SLIs defined in terms of like the job class name, for example. Or SLIs, I mean, you may view it as you want to be able to break down by the job class name for analysis purposes.
yeah, and I can see that going either way. It's like you can, if a job is slow, or if it takes a while for a job to process, if there's latency in your job, it might be that the queue is overloaded and that's the thing that is more important to you. Or it could be that the job itself is inefficient or doing more than it should. So I guess it depends on which question you're trying to answer there and what the root cause is. But from just wanting to like view a trace in a waterfall and understand what's happening, like I definitely think having the job name is going to be more helpful.
Yeah, the send and process names are a little bit strange, like the suffixes on the span name, but that's an artifact of the fact that we're using the messaging semantic conventions. So I don't know whether you want to look into creating semantic conventions for job processing.
At the bare minimum, like I think some sort of spec language that says if you're using a background job processor, some of the messaging semantic conventions will apply and should be used, but for span name, the span name should be the name of the job. The queue should be an attribute or something like that. I think that would be reasonable.
Cool. The other issue I wanted to discuss is Kafka related again. This is, it's this PR and the associated issue. The associated issue, there's two things here, but let's start with kind of the associated issue here, which is this difference in logic between these two things. It's basically if you extract, so the second one, well, in both cases, you're extracting the parent context, which is a full context. You then, in the second case, you're setting the current context to be the parent context, and then you're just doing an in span without specifying the parent, so you pick up the implicit parent. this has the effect of setting both the parent, but also propagating baggage and any other context that comes with it. The first case, you're extracting the parent context, but then you're passing the parent context into tracer in span, which only extracts the span context. So it doesn't actually propagate effectively any of the other contexts, so baggage in this case, into the current context. So the question is really, is this intentional? I had a cursory look at the spec and I didn't see any language around this kind of helper. Like in-span is really a helper that we've defined. It's not defined in the spec. I think the spec alludes to it, that, you know, this kind of helper might be useful, but it doesn't really define what it should do. And the difference in behavior is a bit weird because we discard everything except the span context in the first case.
Yeah, my feeling is that this is a bug and that both of these things should be equivalent. So perhaps the right thing to do is inside with span or in span, if you get a with parent, you should do a with current. Or something along those lines, but
Okay, so I can PR that fix. It brings up a second issue that is more Kafka specific. There's this weirdness around like baggage propagation, context propagation, parenting, and so forth. So in Kafka, like in the messaging semantic conventions, there's these 3 examples presented, and the crux of it is really that the parenting information should effectively be discarded in most cases for, like the parent should either be, sorry, here I'm talking about the process span. So some Q name space process as the span. The parent in some cases is going to be the receiver span. In other cases, there's no parent. But in all cases, there's a link from the process span to the send span. So only the link is really important and the parenting information is not. It's really challenging to actually do that properly in with the APIs that we've defined. It's just really hard to do because you kind of want to set, like what this person wants to do is actually set the baggage, or like propagate the baggage context, but not necessarily propagate the parent, and instead have either a nil parent or the parent come from the current context before you do the extract. But you do want to get the linkage information. So it's like, how do you propagate everything except the parent? Or how do you get the, maybe we're just using extract wrong. Maybe that's my problem, that I'm misunderstanding the way extract works, but it's just a little bit complex right now to reason about propagating some but not all of the context, not using the parent from extract, using the parent from whatever your current context is set. So all that stuff. Sorry, I know that's vague and hand wavy, but it's a really vague and hand wavy part of the spec.
Yeah, so like, I looked at that issue in the PR that he put up. It seems that basically, like when we process the span after it was produced, we just want to create a link. We don't actually want to like pull the producer's context in. But by doing so, when we just create the link, the baggage isn't being propagated. So the change that was proposed now sets the parent context while they're just trying to get the baggage. So how do we propagate the baggage without the actual parent context? Like, how do we do just links and baggage in this case? Is like, it seems to be the issue that we're facing with their solution.
Yeah, it's kind of everything. Like, I assume context could be more than just baggage and the trace parent, right? Somebody could define some other context that they want to propagate and some mechanism for propagating that. So what it really comes down to is you want to propagate like all the context except the current parent or the parent, right?
Yeah, so try to navigate through this. So I think there are a few things at play here. Like, one is that we have extract. Extract will get you a context, and it kind of, the idea is that this is the exact same context that you had in your process on the injecting side. So, and then I think from there, you kind of have two options. Once you've extracted your context, you can restore that context, or you can just, if that's not what you want to do, if you don't want to set that as the currently active context in your process, you can just have a handle on the context and do something with it. And in that second case, you could interact with the baggage in that context without making it active. Yeah, you should be able to make a new context that didn't contain a parent and pick and pull things into it if you needed to do that. I'm not sure what all the APIs look like, though. There might be some room for API improvement if this is a thing that we need to do.
Yeah, I think in this case, you can probably resolve it by grabbing your parent context before you do the extract, or at least grabbing the span context from that in some way, and then passing that into with parent. Or if you really want a root span, then you do a with parent. It's a little bit weird because you have to do a with parent with an invalid trace context or span context. I forget which. Yeah, it's so that part of the API is a little bit awkward. We have this thing that does a start root span, but we don't have an easy way to explicitly start a root span using like in span, or I think with span, maybe it's just in span. Anyway, yeah, short form, I think you can muck around with it, but the code is a little bit ugly to do that.
Yeah, so yeah, I think it's, if it can be mucked around with and we can kind of see what this actually looks like in code, I think that would be useful. And then I would say the next step would be to just kind of understand if this is something unique to the design in Ruby, or if just kind of see like what's available in some of the other languages and see how awkward it is, and see if it's like something that we're inducing on ourselves, or if we are kind of following generally the Spect API and it's a larger issue. And then depending on what we figured out there, we can either try to make some improvements either to Ruby, things at the spec level, or I feel like there is maybe this situation that Kafka is just hard, and
Yes, I wholeheartedly agree with that. Kafka is very hard, especially from an instrumentation perspective, in not just in Ruby. The design of Sarama, for example, which is one of the popular Go packages for interacting with Kafka, makes a lot of context propagation effectively impossible. So yeah, Kafka's hard.
yeah, and if it just ends up being that Kafka's hard, but we can still instrument it with some less than ideal code, and this is the only place it's like biting us, I don't know, maybe we can just heavily comment the code and try not to look at it too much and move on with our lives. But if it is indicative of some kind of bigger problem, I think we should try to find some solutions to it.
Okay. Yeah, I haven't seen any other examples. Like Kafka just seems to come up as the problem child all the time. I will PR a fix to InSpan so that we can pick up the context, and then I'll at least sketch out what I think the code is to fix this current problem for Kafka. And yeah, probably if we can get a bunch of eyes on that, that would be helpful.
Cool. Yeah, that sounds good. And yeah, and there will be another release coming through soon as well.
Yep.
Great. All right, we're 2 minutes over. Any last minute concerns?
I pinged you, Matt, on a bunch of old issues. I went through and tried to do a big cleanup, or at least a bit of an issue sweep last night, just to identify stale issues that we've long since resolved but never closed. And also to make sure that things are tagged against the right milestone. So if you can just take a look at those and close the ones that should be closed, that'd be great.
Okay, will do.
That's all I had.
Cool. All right. Well, I guess I'll see everybody online.
See you guys.
Thanks. See ya.
So yeah.